The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and while it was another race win for Max Verstappen and another weekend when Red Bull was in the headlines for the wrong reasons, the big story was unexpected F1 debutant Ollie Bearman's 7th place for Ferrari. I'm Ed Straw, and joining us to tell you all about it are Mark Hughes, Scott Mitchell-Malm and Samarth Kanal. Well, Mark, we'll come to you first. 4th Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, not perhaps the most thrilling race in terms of dissecting the performance, etc., but always an interesting track, this one, isn't it?
Yeah, and in fact, the contrast between what a thrilling track it is when you look at the high speeds and how close the walls are and how flat out it is, and a real hardcore track. The contrast between that and the sort of uneventful nature of the race was quite striking.
Yeah, a bit of a shame, really, but there were still lots of storylines, which is good. And Scott Mitchell-Malm, how have you been enjoying this one?
Certainly not the most exciting race from Jeddah that we've had. It's produced a mix of genuinely good races and chaotic races in its short history. And I don't think this race was either good or chaotic. But one of the things I do like about it is that it is very challenging. And when there is something at stake, it means that the tension runs pretty much to the end because there's just always the chance of something going awry. And while everything was set at the front in the podium places, there was a little bit of jeopardy throughout, and it meant that Bearman hanging on to that 7th place as he was chased down futilely by Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton just had a bit of edge about it until the end, because he could have had a 3-4 time bigger gap than what he had. But the prospect of getting it slightly wrong, as Lance Stroll did very badly early on, and Fernando Alonso even gave one of the inside walls a little kiss on those really tight blind entries, that was there until the end. And so that is something that this race that has, even when it's a bit quiet.
Yeah, that's very, very true. It's a magnificent driving challenge. And Samarth Kanal, how have you found the weekend? I know you've been my cameraman mainly on the way to the circuit for our in-car insights videos, as we like to call them.
Yeah, well, also thank you for driving so safely along the mean streets of Jeddah. Just to follow on from what Scott said, the tension is really what kind of ramps up this race. Magnussen's was interesting. He was pretty all over the place in terms of penalties, and then he held up a train of cars and secured Haas a point. And even in a midfield battle, you can see how kind of exciting things get on a street circuit.
Yeah, exactly. So there are lots of positives, as always, and lots of storylines for us to delve into. So let's get into it. Scott, it's pretty unusual for us to focus on the driver finishing 7th, but in this case, it's justified, isn't it? Because it's not every day a driver makes their F1 debut. Rarer still, they do it for Ferrari at the age of 18, and vanishingly rare that they do so well. You followed Bearman's weekend closely after he was flung in at the deep end in place of Carlos Sainz, who was at the track on Saturday and recovering from his surgery after being struck with appendicitis. So how impressive was Ollie Bearman?
Very impressive, and I say that as someone who had high expectations for him in terms of how he would deal with this situation. I'm not alone in rating Bearman very highly, but long before this weekend I followed, for example, his Mexico FP1 outing for Haas. Every single lap of that, I did the same in Abu Dhabi as well. The F1 adjacent work that he has done, whether that's in Formula 2 or Formula 3 or whatever, I've always watched his categories. I know what a great driver, what a great young driver he looks like, and how much potential he's got. And having seen some of the traits that he's exhibited in the junior categories and also in his practice outings and testing, I know how highly rated he is from a mental point of view. His capacity to deal with things is extremely high, and he has a fantastic approach in that he's wonderfully attacking and confident and proactive about the way he goes about things. But he judges that line superbly well in terms of he doesn't overshoot from the very start, but he's very, very happy to go to the limit quite quickly. So I thought that stood him in good stead. When you layer that all together, I had high hopes. But high hopes means not looking out of depth, not crashing, not embarrassing himself. It doesn't mean coming agonisingly close to a Q3 spot, which actually he probably should have got if he'd hooked up everything in Q2 the way he could have done. He could have been in the top 10 shootout. And it's certainly not finishing 7th in the race, because frankly, that result is basically acceptable if you're a full-time Ferrari driver. In Leclerc's hands, it was clearly the second fastest car this weekend, but that lead group is pretty tight, with Aston Martin more competitive this weekend, Mercedes and McLaren about there as well. Perfectly conceivable that either Ferrari driver could end up 6th or 7th on a given race weekend with how that lead fight is. So Bearman's basically, in the space of 2 days, a disjointed practice session and qualifying, and then his Grand Prix debut, got to about where a Ferrari driver could be if they were a full-time driver. And I think that says an awful lot about the way he performed and performed above expectations.
Yeah, the thing I really like is I always say these are cometh the hour opportunities, aren't they? Thrown at the deep end, you can change the course of your career by nailing it. And that's absolutely what he did. Just hugely impressive. And the thing that really stood out actually was something not anything he did, but the amount of positivity and effort his rivals made to grab him and say well done after the race, after qualifying as well. And you saw various fairly significant paddock figures doing that as well after the race. So yeah, just a huge impression, not just to the outside world, but to the decision makers too, and to his fellow F1 drivers.
Yeah, they treated him like a peer. They didn't treat him like someone who was getting a one-off chance, or, you know, this was a lovely little bonus for him and a little extra thing for him to tick off. This was a bunch of drivers recognising someone with a huge amount of ability and potential, and then also recognising the job they actually did. There was nothing patronising about the way they talked about Bearman. It was full-on praise and recognition of a job well done in tough circumstances. I would say, just very quickly getting into some specifics about the race performance, because I did follow everything through practice, qualifying and the Grand Prix, followed it all on board. And inevitably there were rougher moments. I was almost said rough, but rougher, in that he had slightly questionable car positioning at times on the first lap or two, where someone with more experience isn't making himself quite so vulnerable. I feel like there were one or two opportunities to be slightly sharper in battle, not just early on, but for example, after the restart behind Zhou Guanyu, and then Nico Hülkenberg lost a few laps there, damaging his tyres, costing himself race time, the sort of things that can add up by a race distance. But these are really micro details, and even within that, there are counterpoints. His move on Yuki Tsunoda at the restart is one of the best overtakes I've seen at this track.
It's funny that I asked him after the race about that one, because I mentioned there are a few key overtakes, and I mentioned the Tsunoda one with the dummy, and his face lit up. He had a big smile on his face. He really enjoyed that one and enjoyed talking about it too.
It was fantastic, because it's not just a late dive under brakes. He was on the wrong side of the track, and it wasn't quite a dummy, because I don't think he was necessarily setting up Tsunoda to open up the corner as such, but it was reactive. It was instinctive in the moment. He recognised that there would be an opportunity under braking. Tsunoda had committed to that line by that point, and he basically had to almost lift out of it to get back behind Tsunoda to be able to move left to then dive down the inside, to do all of that, and to do all that at the restart as well, where you're not really sure where the tyres and the brakes are going to be. That was exquisite judgment. And it was that perfect blend of aggression and ability, and without overstepping the mark. So that was absolutely fantastic. But I was so impressed through the race by, once he'd potentially done a bit of damage at the start of the stint in behind Joe and then behind Hülkenberg in particular, he just seemed to get the tyres under control for a while. The pace was, I thought initially, I was a bit worried he was quite a long way off Leclerc, and that if that was his pace for the rest of the stint, it would be a bit uncompetitive. But I think he was actually just in management mode, because he was just getting things under control at the start of that stint, because there was a turning point. He suddenly lowered his lap time by several tenths of a second, and from that moment onwards was on that pace or improving that pace right to the very end. So not only was he able to keep things clean and get things done and have a couple of nice eye-catching moments, his pace step and the way he was able to hold that pace to the end of the Grand Prix, relative to Leclerc as well, not just the guys who were around him in that position, in sort of 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, it was exactly where that car should have been. And I think to have got to that phase himself through the grid, wasn't being coached dramatically by Ferrari or anything like that. I think that spoke volumes for the way that he was able to apply himself and then also cash in on the opportunities in the race itself.
Absolutely, and hugely impressive, because after that early race safety car, his target really was P7. We were talking about this live, weren't we, Scott? And I was sort of saying, well, 7th is there, and he delivered what he needed to take 7th. He was only a few seconds behind George Russell, kept Norris at arm's length after Norris and Hamilton made their stops to take softs late on. So that was really good. Now, inevitably, we've got loads of questions about Bearman from the Race Members Club, so we'll tackle those now by way of a sneak preview of the final part of the podcast. So, Mark, Lucky Cohen says, after Ollie Bearman's F1 debut with Ferrari, how likely is it that he will get a full-time race seat in 2025? And what else does he have to do to get that? And on a similar note, Nick Wolf asks how his mega performance impacts his prospects for a seat.
Oh, I think it's very difficult to envisage him not being in a full-time seat next year. Obviously, you would think it would probably be Haas. That's probably where Ferrari is going to place him. So I think he would really need to mess up his Formula 2 season to not be in Formula 1, just on what he's done this weekend. And what was particularly impressive, just to add to what you've all been saying, I think that result wasn't flattered by circumstances. It was actually, if he'd just not made that slight mistake in Q2 and gone slightly too deep into turn 22 and done that lap when the tyres were new, he would have got through to Q3 and probably would have qualified about 6th or 7th. And from there, I think he's looking at something like a 4th or 5th place finish, given where the car was at and given where he was at. So I think actually 7th undersold how competitive he actually was. We could have actually been looking at something even more head-turning with the, roughly the same amount of merit. So yeah, I think everyone will have seen that. Everyone up and down the paddock will have seen that, and I think he will be heavily in demand. But obviously, he's a Ferrari driver, so his career will be dictated by them to an extent.
And Samarth, the next question from Mark Martin: what made Ferrari pick Bearman over Robert Schwartzman?
Well, as you know, Ferrari kind of run a WEC program with their LMH cars, and Robert Schwartzman's busy with that. And he could have come here, except Fred Vasseur said that it was stupid to bring more than one reserve driver to a race. He said that there was no point doing it. With drivers running the WEC program, he said that it would basically take more time out of their schedules to bring them to different countries in between WEC races. So Ollie Bearman was basically the reserve that they'd chosen to be here this weekend. Every F2 race Ollie Bearman will be at, he'll be the reserve driver for Ferrari. And they didn't hesitate calling him up, and he did a great job in that regard. Funnily enough, Vasseur also mentioned that Sainz was absolutely destroyed, and I quote that, destroyed, after doing his FP1 and FP2 sessions. So they started to think something was really wrong there, and then they didn't hesitate calling up Ollie Bearman to just come up. So yeah, that was it. It was a really obvious choice for them.
Yeah, and of course you could say the same applies to Antonio Giovinazzi, also in WEC and in the Ferrari fold. A question now for Mark Andrews, who says, in the last 2 seasons, we've seen both Liam Lawson and Bearman thrown into the deep end. Who had the tougher job and who did the better job? Well, I would argue both had an incredibly tough job. I do think Bearman had a tougher job. He had a more competitive car than Lawson did, but he's an 18-year-old. He's being thrown in to make his debut as a Ferrari driver at a very tough track. Now, Zandvoort's a tough track as well, but Saudi Arabia, Jeddah, Corniche circuit is a very tricky one as well. So I think that they both had difficult jobs. I would put Bearman a bit ahead, but it's not like Lawson had it easy. He had a really tough job. And it's what I always like to see with drivers like this when they get thrown in at the deep end and they seize the opportunity. Lawson did it. Bearman did it today. We've seen drivers in the past do it. For example, Kenwi Kobayashi springs to mind when he had his sub-outings for Toyota at the end of 2009. He was not going anywhere near F1 before that. And then suddenly he was a full-time driver the year after. Drivers just take those opportunities if they've got a bit about them. And a connected question mark from Christopher Parrott. Where does Bearman's performance rank in the pantheon of F1 debuts?
Oh, I think it's right up there. It's, the really sensational ones, you think back to Mario Andretti putting it on pole in 68 on his debut. Ricardo Rodriguez at 19 putting it on the front row at Monza for Ferrari. Gilles Villeneuve in an obsolete McLaren at Silverstone in 77. But these are all, what very, very high caliber drivers do. And then when you look back in hindsight, you say, well, of course it did that. That's how good they are. And I think we'll be looking back in time about Bearman saying the same thing.
And Scott, a question from Via Nikari, who says, how soon will Bearman replace Magnussen?
I think it would be very unfortunate and probably unfair on Magnussen if it came this season. But that will depend on Magnussen's performances. I'm sure we'll get onto this later on, was mostly impressed by what Magnussen did this weekend, especially in the race and the role that he played for Haas. But we know that Magnussen ultimately has a limit as a Grand Prix driver. And Ayo Komatsu, the new Haas team principal, is acutely aware of that limit because in his previous role as the leader of the engineering group at Haas trackside, he's very in tune with Kevin's limitations as a driver and sort of, even if he pieces everything together, what his maximum is. He's also massively a fan of Bearman. He was really impressed by what he did in the FP1 outings last year. So my suspicion is Ferrari will want Bearman to have a Ferrari F1 drive as soon as possible, and Haas has a team principal that will want to have Bearman in the car as soon as possible. If Magnussen gives them a reason to replace him this year, I can see them taking that opportunity. If not, it'll be for 2025.
And the final question I'll take from Dave Langford, who says, when was the last time a Grand Prix driver made his debut for Ferrari in F1? Well, very simple answer. 1972 British Grand Prix Arturo Mazzario, who finished 6th. Like a stat like that, that's always good fun. Now, before we move on, a quick reminder about a survey our friends at The Athletic are running. We're very grateful you listen to us, but now we want to hear from you. We're asking you to fill out a quick survey about you and your podcast habits by going to theathletic.com/survey24. 3 lucky entries will win £100 or dollars worth of Amazon vouchers as well. So whether you're a long-time listener or a new one, we want your feedback. Go to theathletic.com/survey24. That's theathletic.com/survey24. The link is also in our episode description.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit-card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast. Easier said, done. Right, Mark, it's time now for your favourite question. Can you explain how the race was won, please?
Fastest driver and fastest car set pole won the start. That's what happened. It was the interest in this race wasn't really centred around that. That was a given, and it was more to do with why was there such a lack of variation in the race, and there were several reasons for that, and that distinguished this race from previous Grand Prix at Jeddah. The Pirelli hard compound had very, very low deg, and the early safety car, which brought almost everybody in on the same lap, meant everybody was on the same tyre of the same age. And also there was quite a clear step change in the actual performance orders of the cars in the front of the field this weekend. The Red Bull was fastest, obviously. The next step down being the Ferrari, which was significantly faster than the McLaren, which had a clear edge on the Aston Martin, which was faster than the Mercedes. And so they were all in their natural performance order. And that was really it.
Yeah, sometimes it's the way, isn't it? Would you like to just try and quantify the gap, Ferrari to Red Bull? Obviously still trying to get a feel for that this season. Ferrari still the closest challenger, but not quite in the same postcode.
Yeah, it was in just time terms, it was about half what it had been in Bahrain, but you'd sort of expect that because one of the Red Bull's big advantages of the last 3 years is that it's how it balances the tyre deg between the front and rear axles, and because Jeddah's not a circuit that places particular strain and doesn't induce very high tyre deg, that difference is much smaller. So the Red Bull's advantage is reduced, but it's still there, of course, but it's reduced. So although it was only half as far away as it had been in Bahrain, I don't think that means anything significant.
I'm actually, I know it's very early days to say this, starting to get a little bit of a Verstappen 2020 vibe from the way Leclerc and Ferrari have started this season. I feel like the kind of order behind them's changing a lot more than the order for who's the best team and who's the second best team is going to change early on. And Leclerc is just operating at such a high level. He started this season as well as he ended last season. And I saw something, I can't remember what it is, but is it like seven or eight races in a row now he's qualified on the front row? Just basically ever since that car got more to his liking in the back part of last year. So he's excelling in qualifying, but he's also doing a great job in the race. And if it continues like this, because just a word on Sergio Perez, I think he's done a good job. You consider how difficult last season got for him at points. He really does seem to have been revitalised by the new season and the new car, and is doing exactly what Red Bull needs him to do, which means when the car's that good, both Red Bulls will be 1 and 2. They might not be that in qualifying, because that's not where Perez shines and it is where Leclerc shines, but that is what the natural order should be in every race. Red Bull 1 and 2. Then it's a case of who finishes third. But at the moment, like this is where the Verstappen 2020 comparison comes in. It just feels like that's going to be Leclerc now, because that car does look like it's got the edge on the others. And I say Leclerc's at this fantastic level, and I just feel like he could be the bridesmaid to the Red Bulls for quite a few races this season.
Yeah, both a good achievement for him and incredibly frustrating, doubtless. Now, of course, Scott, the difference between Red Bull's on-track serenity and the choppy waters off-track, stark this weekend. what did we learn in this saga that we've been talking about endlessly for the past month during the Jeddah weekend?
Yeah, it's really difficult to pick out new lessons in this sometimes because it just feels like it's been this one giant mess for about, 4 or 5 weeks now? But the big thing for me this weekend was the way it escalated for Verstappen in the context of the story around Helmut Marko, that Marko fueled himself after qualifying, indicating that he could potentially be suspended. He didn't know, but there was a bit of a suggestion that there wasn't really any basis for him to be suspended, but he just wasn't ruling it out, which seems to relate to Red Bull, maybe Horner, maybe Red Bull GmbH, taking an interest in different things that seem to have been leaked at different points over the last few weeks. I'm not talking explicitly about the dossier of alleged evidence that was sent out to all those people in Bahrain, but there's been all sorts of chatter, and Marko may or may not have been involved in that. And Red Bull, the suggestion is that Red Bull just wanted to establish that, so they've been probing a little bit. And that went down really badly with Verstappen, who, and I don't mean this to say that he's been two-faced, but he showed his colours and his real allegiances for the first time in all this, because he's been very neutral. Everything that's been kicking off, Max has pretty much stayed out of it. And when he has been drawn into it, he's said very little. He's offered qualified support to Horner at times. He sort of defended his dad when Jos went off on his rant after Bahrain, but he didn't really say that he completely agreed with it, and also didn't say he didn't. He's been very careful with what he said. But when this Marko stuff came out, Max was flat out, absolutely adamant. And the first time I've ever heard Verstappen link his situation, his future, to anybody else or anything else. But he basically said, if Marko goes, then I might go as well. Said that whatever Marko does impacts his decision making for his own future, which was massive. That's such a big thing for Verstappen to have come out and done. And then 24 hours later, you have Horner not really ruling it out. And I think hinting that he might actually want to call Verstappen's bluff over this and just be like, all right, well, you want to leave over this guy? You really want to walk away from the fastest car in F1? All these wins and more titles? If you want to do that, I've got a dozen other drivers that want that seat, and I bet a bunch of them could win races as well. I feel like that's where Horner's position is sort of meandering towards, and I don't know if it's a power play because of all the other nonsense. I don't know if it's how he genuinely feels, and this is the opportunity, the first opportunity he has had to actually assert that position. But it's that development, to me, is the most significant element in terms of the way the Red Bull stuff is playing out and all of that internal politics.
Yeah, and it just continues to be an absolutely astonishing situation. And you've got to say, Mark, this isn't the end of it, is it? Something's going to happen. We keep saying something will happen next, and then something happens, normally even quicker than we expect.
Yeah, that's certainly been what's happened so far. A sort of uneasy peace seems to have broken out at the end of this weekend after Mintzlaff has had his meetings with both Horner and Marko, and tentatively confirmed that there will be no changes, and it seems as though peace may have broken out, but the underlying tensions and the power play are still going to be there. There's no reason why they won't be there, and it's just how that is going to manifest itself next, how and when, and so yeah, stay tuned.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about this plenty in the future, no matter how much we'd rather there was a different topic, because this has taken up so much time. But yeah, it's an unresolved situation still. Uneasy peace, I think, the phrase that was used, and I completely agree with that. We
do have a quite lengthy video going out on this. So while we've kind of covered the main points in a bit of a quickfire fashion there, if anyone does want to learn a bit more about it and go into it in a bit more detail, that video will be going up on our YouTube channel at some point overnight, I think, after this race. So by the time you listen to this, it might be live, it might not, who knows, but go there if you want to have a bit more of a deep dive into it.
Exactly. We didn't want to take over the post-race podcast completely with this, despite the fact it's tried to overrun the F1 season. Now, McLaren took fourth with Oscar Piastri, although Norris was down in eighth after being on the wrong side of the strategic split under the early safety car. Again, McLaren was brisk, but not quite quick enough to be at the front of the chasing pack. So why is that, Samarth?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, it's definitely high. It's definitely top speed rather, not high speed, where McLaren seems to suffer. So that's a big limitation, and we did see it a little bit in the Piastri-Hamilton battle. What we also saw, though, is Piastri really enjoyed Sector 1. He had the run of it at some point, and that's where kind of McLaren have an advantage. So it's those short, sharp, kind of winding corners that they're really quite fast. And there's some directional changes there, which kind of bodes well for their car balance. However, their limitations also seem to be in corners that are quite long. So if there's a long turning point, they seem to just struggle to keep the car turned in at the same level of grip as, for example, Ferrari or Red Bull. That's really where they see their limitations. Mark, do you agree with that? Do you see anything else there with McLaren's limitations?
Just the slow corners, and so that corner onto the straight was it's unfortunate for them, because not only were they down on top speed, but they were slow onto the straight as well. And I think with DRS, his advantage over Hamilton was 6 kph, something like that, which wasn't really enough. So yeah, it's that combination. It's just not very aero efficient at its top end. It's super fast through fast corners, and there was one particular corner in that sequence, that turn 6 to 10 sequence, where a Piastri in qualifying was 5 kilometers up, even on Verstappen. So, if all the corners were like that, it would be on pole and leaving the Red Bull behind, but of course they're not. So yeah, it's just a little bit unbalanced in where its performance is and the type of corners that its performance is. So yeah, it's a trait that's been there for the last couple of years, and it's clearly still there in this one.
Yeah, and there's a hope that can be tackled partially during the first third of the season. That's the timeline Andrea Stella, the team principal, put on it. But he did say it was kind of a year-long project to tackle the weaknesses and make the McLaren more of an all-rounder, and that they have to go through all of that because it's essential to do so in order to ensure they're where they need to be in 2026. So yeah, there's some work to do for McLaren. The car's good, but yeah, it's certainly not going to be beating Red Bull on merit any time soon. Scott, can you quickly explain to listeners who might be wondering why Lando Norris wasn't done for a jump start? Because he certainly moved before the lights.
Yeah, so basically there's a bit of tolerance that's allowed. The way that a jump start is judged is by the transponder that's fitted to the car, and essentially if the transponder judges a certain amount of movement, then that is what constitutes starting effectively. And that's not what happened. So while there was a small amount of movement from the car, not enough to trigger the transponder effectively, and therefore, as the rules are framed, not a jump start.
I love how Russell snitched straight away on the radio and just said, "Jump start, Norris."
It fits your. I think you're not alone in this, Mark. But it fits the often characterization of the head boy.
Yeah.
Kind of properly, doesn't it? It's just like, sir, he's broken the rules.
He was probably composing a PowerPoint presentation to go with it as well. But yeah, Lando Norris basically admitted that it was sort of his mistake because it was a pure instinctive reaction. He said so. It's like he almost thought the start was there and it wasn't, and then I think he was quite pleased that he managed to get it stopped so he could then do a legal start within the bounds that you mentioned there, Scott. But yeah, a frustrating race for Norris. He obviously was on the wrong side of that strategic split, but he did say, well, it was worth a go. Sometimes I feel we're not aggressive enough. This time it didn't work, so he wasn't particularly furious about it. And obviously going on to those softs later on, there wasn't enough of a pace offset to close down Ollie Bearman and try and do better than 8th, but he did manage to beat Lewis Hamilton. Now, let's talk about Mercedes in detail, Scott. Had a tough weekend. George Russell was 6th behind the excellent Fernando Alonso. Lewis Hamilton was 9th, having stayed out under the safety car. Did the Mercedes struggles this weekend raise any doubts for you?
Yes, yeah, definitely. After Bahrain, you could say, well, first race weekend, they've done the test as well, but first race weekend with the new car, this is meant to set a baseline. So as long as the car's responding well and doing everything it's meant to do and that they want it to do, if it's now just a case of layering on performance, then fair enough. That's kind of what you'd expect to be, right? Mercedes' first proper go at these regulations, effectively, after redoing the concept. It was never going to be on Red Bull's level when this is the third evolution of a brilliant, brilliant starting point for Red Bull back in 2022. But I feel like this weekend kind of indicated that there are some worryingly familiar limitations so it's not just about, they just need to add performance. The ride quality doesn't look so good. They're triggering some bouncing. The car doesn't look that convincing at high speed. And Hamilton, I wonder, because I wasn't following him on board, given that we had at least 2 radio messages broadcast where Hamilton commented on how good the McLaren was at high speed, I can only imagine how many times he mentioned it over the course of the race, because I suspect there might have been a bit of a deliberate play there of like, I'm going to get this message across, not necessarily to the outside world, but just want to make sure that the team really understands that this car is killing me in the high speed stuff. And it just feels like a bit of the same old. And obviously I think you've got a bit of a better understanding of it, Ed, based on who you've spoken to, but it doesn't fill me with confidence that they have actually understood these regs as well as they were suggesting they had and that we were expecting them to have by now.
Yeah, exactly. I asked Toto Wolff after the race I stated that the comments the drivers were making about not being able to get in the sweet spot, the bouncing problems, difficulty running close to the ground and stiff, have worrying echoes of the past 2 seasons. And basically Wolff said, it's been 2.5 years that we're chasing this fundamental, he didn't quite finish his point, but obviously it's a fundamental problem and they are still missing something. And that's a real concern because they seem to think that they were reasonably well on top of things and they had a car that they could just evolve nicely now. They've not got that, though. That's the concern. They have made big improvements into this year, but there's still, I think, mysteries of this rule set and how you make the most of a ground effect car, getting it to run low, generating the downforce that you expect and while not hitting other problems, and getting it to realise the consistent downforce that the simulation tools tell them they get. It's just not all coming together.
Yeah, that very low ride height that you get at very high speeds, it's not working. And looking at the GPS traces, and I've looked through them, it was the slowest car through turn 6 to 10. It was 4 kilometers slower than the Alpine, for example, through that sequence. 11 clicks slower than the Red Bull and the Ferrari. So it's by far the slowest in that type of corner.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and I'd be really concerned if I was there because it's something they've been looking at for a very long time, and they've just not got to the bottom of it. Now, it is difficult, and obviously when you get to these very, very low ride heights, when the floor's very close to the ground, it does get enormously complicated. It's difficult to simulate, but they're at a knowledge deficit there. They don't know exactly what the answer is here, and I think it's going to be another season where they will hit in certain track configurations these difficult weekends. I don't think it'll be as bad as last year, and certainly not the year before, but there will be some difficulties, and I think they have to just make sure that they understand and accept the position they're in and really tackle it. They say they're not going to be complacent, and I genuinely think they think they're not being, but you just wonder if they've again underestimated how much needs to be done to master that problem. Progress made, but not enough. Shall we talk about Haas now, Mark? Because they managed to nick a point. Considering the expectations were so aggressively managed in the build-up to the season, it was pretty remarkable. It was Nico Hülkenberg who took the 10th place, but how crucial was Kevin Magnussen to this result?
Oh, totally crucial. Of course, he took a couple of 10-second penalties for driving indiscretions, but he then used the fact, or Haas then used the fact that his race was ruined to for him to act as blocker for all the cars behind which Hülkenberg would have dropped because he was out of sequence. He hadn't stopped. He'd done the Norris-Hamilton strategy. So he would have dropped right into the middle of that pack of the Alpines and Albon and Sargent and Ricciardo. He would have been in the middle of that pack, so his race would have been, just a scrappy one out of the points. But Magnussen, through foul means or fair, bunched them all up for long enough that there was that nice little gap for Hülkenberg to drop into, and as soon as it was there, in he came, and it was a brilliant team strategy, or they pounced upon an opportunity.
And I think there's probably one other driver you would depend on to do what Magnussen did. That's Fernando Alonso.
Okay. I was going to suggest Esteban Ocon.
Oh, well, Ocon could do it. Yeah, maybe Ocon as well. He's an obstinate character in battle as well. He's done some great defensive drives. There was a point where Magnussen and Ocon were together, and I thought, this one could end it. But it is. But it reminded.
I think you should. I think you should tell them exactly what it was that you said. Because you messaged me. Did
I both say? I think I may suggest they both end up in the sea. There was the slightly flippant phrase I used. But the reason Alonso leapt to mind was because of, and this involves Ocon as well, that Hungarian Grand Prix drive a few years ago where Alonso just kept Hamilton at bay for 10 laps, and that allowed Ocon to win the race. And Magnussen's very, very good at this. He is a very hard racer, and we shouldn't underestimate, it wasn't just driving round several seconds slow. He was doing that, but he was also very, very aggressive. And Ao Komatsu after the race was delighted with it, and because there was the point where it looked like Tsunoda had got him, but Magnussen managed to get back ahead and make it all work. So I think it was really good. It was not a great weekend certainly not a great race for Magnussen in general, but he elevated it by playing this amazing cameo role. And he didn't just buy Hülkenberg a few seconds. He bought him a whole heap of time, the vast majority of a pit stop window, which was remarkable. I think it's worth noting as well, it was good for Haas to have a strong day because actually the qualifying day went pretty badly for them. The car was brisk. There was kind of a puncher's chance of nicking a Q3 place. They wouldn't in normal circumstances, but if Magnussen was pretty quick this weekend as well. If Hülkenberg and Magnussen had been able to hook it up and others underachieved a bit, they might have just slipped through. But they both had problems. Magnussen was a timing disaster. They realised he did an outlap and a prep lap for the tyres, and halfway around the prep lap they suddenly had a massive panic about, no push, you're not going to make it, and he didn't make it, and Hülkenberg was basically sent out without enough fuel in for Q2, and that was a result of some kind of problem with the fueling. It wasn't they forgot, they thought they had, and there just wasn't the fuel in there. So it was good for Haas, and I think with everything that's been going on there, they should be delighted with having a point, because we've got this split. There's a clear top 5 teams. And the joke is that the other 5 teams are just there trying to beat Lance Stroll. That's what plenty of people in the paddock have been saying. But Lance Stroll, of course, was out of the race. So, there was a point on offer there. And well done to Nico Hülkenberg, well done to Kevin Magnussen and Haas. Right, it's the final part of our Grand Prix review podcast, so that means it's time for questions from the Race Members Club. Thanks to everyone who supports us, we massively appreciate it. Remember, you can now subscribe to The Race on Apple Podcasts, where for £3.99 per month or £34.99 a year, you can enjoy ad-free listening. Race Members Club bonus episodes and early access to Bring Back V10's episodes, plus the convenience of having all your favourite podcasts from the race in one channel. Also, there's the option to join the Race Members Club via our website, where you get all of the extra podcasts, plus other things like an ad-free web environment, member discounts, and the opportunity to ask questions on this podcast for £2.99 a month. Sign up via the link in the description for this episode. As always, loads of questions. We'll pile through what we can, but I can only apologise we won't have time for all of them. Mark, question from Hugo Pring. Will Red Bull already be beginning to move focus to next year? Like most F1 fans, possibly.
They can afford to, but I think there's plenty of development and pressing on to do with this year's car yet. I don't think they'll be satisfied with just half a second a lap advantage in the race. They'll be pressing on the assumption that the others might find half a second, even if they won't. So yes, they'll certainly be looking towards 25, but even more than that, they'll be looking towards 26. And yeah, they'll certainly have resources devoted to that at the moment. But once you've got a nice, comfortable advantage, it does give you that luxury of being able to afford to devote a bit more time to the future.
Yeah, very much a virtuous circle when you're competitive, isn't it, in terms of future development. Samarth, J.A. Vanderwaal says, to what extent do you think Alonso is happy with Aston Martin right now? The performance of the Aston, of course, is less than a year ago, and Alonso is, in my opinion, handing out small needle drops. How do you see it, and what would be his possible exit strategy?
Yeah, I think his unhappiness, if that's a word, which it isn't, is growing bit by bit. I mean, he let out little hints that he is looking elsewhere now, and especially that Hamilton's move to Ferrari next year might have opened up a little door for Alonso, something to explore there. And now I can't say for sure if he'll move to Mercedes, but what I can say is that he is looking elsewhere. And with races where the Aston Martin isn't quite keeping up to the pace of other teams, Alonso does seem afterwards to imply that it has had an effect on his mindset when it comes to contract discussions. There's also the fact that Aston Martin isn't perhaps punching where it should be punching in the Constructors' Championship. With Stroll crashing out of his own accord today, it seems like there's one car that's competing for Aston Martin, which is a bit of a shame. And that's something that Alonso will be looking at as well. Mike Crack also acknowledged today after the race that Fernando is looking elsewhere, and Aston Martin should try and keep him. It might be a bit of a task for them. He jokingly turned down the offer of Verstappen and Hamilton, but that was definitely a joke. I stress that's a joke. I think the way Alonso put it was, I don't want to keep Aston Martin waiting. That was quite a polite way to put it. Where do I see his options? That's a tough one. I think he's definitely going to be trying to get the Mercedes seat. He has a lot to offer, I think. Ed, where do you think his options lie?
Oh, Fernando Alonso will be looking at everything. He'll be looking at Red Bull as well, thinking there's just a sliver of a chance of Max Verstappen doing something unexpected, shall we say. But yeah, I think Mercedes will be the one he's looking at most covetously, because that's the one that's there. And as Mark, you explained on an episode, I think our Aston Martin launch podcast, Fernando explained at length how he would be willing to give 100% for any team on and off track, do everything he wants. He knows the clock is very low on time, and he's still not given up the chance of one last shot at a world championship. So Fernando Alonso will be looking at absolutely all opportunities. And I guess the really interesting dynamic there is how long Aston Martin will wait. I think they'll wait a fair while, but they'll want to try and pile the pressure on there. Scott, a question from Zybit Tyler Biggs, who says, reflecting on the 100% takeover by Audi of the Sauber team, are Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu doing enough to justify continuing to hold the seats during the course of the year, or will Audi look to bring in new blood mid-season? My view is that Bottas is struggling to demonstrate he is not a spent force, but will see out all of 2024. But Zhou hasn't been able to show consistent performance to warrant a works drive, and Theo Pourchaire should get a chance. And James Mellier asked a similar question about the impact of the Audi takeover on the driver market.
I think we're going to need to take a trip somewhere, Ed.
Should we take a trip? Yeah, let's take a trip for one moment. We'll be back in a second.
Welcome to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner.
Right, here we are, Scott, for the second time this season in everybody's favourite corner.
Yes, and I feel bad because obviously we're not explicitly talking about misfortune in the race or anything like that, but a little bit of broader Valtteri Bottas sympathy in that the Sauber move, I'm sure he's been well recompensed for it. I think the deal that he did when he left Mercedes was a good one for him. I think financially and personally, it's probably been quite rewarding. Competitively, it hasn't worked out. And if there was going to be that silver lining of, well, this is going to morph into the Audi Works team, so hang on there, and then you're back part of a Works team project again. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced he'll be like the first name on the get list for Audi. So I don't think Bottas is doing a bad job. I don't think he's phoning it in or anything like that. And I think he was better last year than sometimes it looked. But I just think a Carlos Sainz or even a Nico Hülkenberg, who is someone that Andreas Seidel, the Sauber CEO and now the Audi F1 team CEO, rates very highly and is very keen on, I think those will be ahead in the pecking order. And I think objectively, I like Zhou. I think he has had good moments in F1, probably slightly better moments than some people expected he would be capable of. But I don't see him on the grid beyond this season. I think there'd have to be some circumstances that freed up a seat that, for whatever reason, his combination of factors made him a really good candidate for elsewhere. I don't see why, as Audi's gearing up for 26, I don't see why you'd keep Zhou. I mean, you might keep Bottas if you could only get one of your other targets, but you're not keeping Zhou.
Yeah, to add to the sympathy for Bottas, he was a bit unfortunate this weekend because he was balked on his final Q1 lap. He thought he could have been in Q2.
Badly.
He had to properly lift where he should have been flat out. There's to avoid a crash, so nothing he could do about that. And then in the race, when he put on the hards, he just couldn't get any tyre temperature into them. It was just slow. So yeah, a tough one for him. And yeah, Joe had the FP3 crash, and then he had a pit stop disaster, which I'm not sure showed up so well, but that's 2 pit stop disasters Sauber have had this year. On both occasions, it's down to problems with cross-threading the wheel nuts and then have to change the wheel nut because they damage it in doing that. They want a quick fix for that because that's a big problem, and they've upgraded some of their pit equipment this year, but yeah, that's a real object of focus for them. A question now from Matthew Clegg, which I'll take, who says, if Max Verstappen was to leave Red Bull, would that be a help or a hindrance to Sergio Perez? Might it increase the importance for Red Bull to run 2 equally competitive cars in a post-Verstappen world, especially looking to 2026 and beyond? I think generally Perez would see it as quite helpful if Verstappen left, because Verstappen's all-time great and Perez just isn't at his level. No disgrace in that. It's just very difficult. So then you've got all the other questions about, well, who would take Verstappen's place, etc., presumably somebody quite good. But for example, if Verstappen suddenly in the next week said, oh no, I'm done with Red Bull, I'm taking time out of Formula One, then Perez is in with a chance of fighting for the World Championship, and he'd be the favourite, wouldn't he? Because he's been second in the first 2 races. So I don't think that'll be a big problem. I would say Red Bull do run 2 equally competitive cars. What they don't have is 2 equally competitive drivers. And that's simply because if you've got Max Verstappen in one car, it is extremely difficult to find his equal. That's just the difficulty. So, yeah, I think Perez would be perfectly content if Max Verstappen were to leave him Red Bull to himself. Mark, a question from Ben Hawkes. Why were the soft tyre runners not able to make more of an impression on the cars in front at the end of the race? This was Norris and Hamilton, of course.
Yeah, the softs were good for about 2 or 3 laps, and then they fell off quite rapidly. So, yeah, they were just a little bit too soft for the track on the day. And the hard and the medium were you could actually, in theory, have run the entire distance without a stop. Definitely on the hard and probably on the medium as well. That was the consensus after the race among the teams. And yeah, the soft just wasn't very good.
Next up, a question from Danny Elliott for you, Samarth. Yuki Tsunoda comfortably outperformed Ricciardo in qualifying and beat him again in the race. With Perez doing what Red Bull requires of him, is it too early to suggest Ricciardo's time at the top team is over? It does seem Tsunoda has the better of him, just like the few comparable races from last year.
Yeah, I think it might be a bit too early to suggest that, partly because I think the driver market might explode or implode, depending on how you see it. But I do think that Ricciardo definitely is struggling compared to Tsunoda, and he's admitted that himself. He's pretty open about it when he is struggling. Today there was also a slow pit stop that really didn't help him. But yeah, I mean, Ricciardo just seemed to admit that he really didn't have the run of the car today. He really struggled today, and things like that will compound when he's looking for a seat at a top team, wherever that may be. Let's not forget, though, that he has experience. He's won races, and he definitely has the pace. It's just sometimes, as we see, some drivers just don't click with the car. It is it's not a considerably different package, but it is an evolved package from last year, and Ricciardo has plenty of time to get to grips with it. I think that time's going to run out pretty quickly, though. That's what I think.
Next question from Eric Shutton to you, Scott. What is your opinion on driver choices? Does Ollie Bearman's successful debut show that some teams are too conservative in their driver choices? The contrast between Bearman and, for example, Bottas was big in this race. Don't use this as an excuse to go back to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner. Only use that jingle once an episode.
I will. I'm going to deploy that with discretion because I don't want it to get old. I don't think it will ever get old, that jingle, but I need to be careful. With driver choices, I think I struggle. I'm wary of trying to put big generic statements when it comes to driver choices, because I do think it's team specific, circumstance specific, and driver specific. With the Bearman, for example, I don't think it's not an injustice that he's not on the grid already this season. Now, what he's proven this weekend is clearly that he is capable of being a very, very good F1 driver. And if you put him in F1 now, actually, he would do a good job. And if a team had wanted to take a punt on him as a rookie for this year, I suspect he would have performed admirably, and this weekend is evidence of that. But it's not like when, for example, Piastri won F2 so convincingly as a rookie and then couldn't get a seat for the following year. That's ridiculous. That had a more egregious example of someone else getting a seat because, and I said this earlier, Joe, I think, has done quite well in F1 at times, but he got an F1 seat, having been comprehensively beaten by Piastri in F2 when Joe was not a rookie and Piastri was. So that was a lot more frustrating because it's needlessly cautious. And there are some reasons for it in terms of, like I say, team circumstances. How long do you want to drive for? Do you want to take one on loan? Blah, blah, blah. But that's the kind of thing that sucks. When it's someone like Bearman, less so because you think, okay, well, actually F2 is probably the right place for him to be this year. Now we just know that he's ready for an F1 drive as soon as one becomes available, which is brilliant. So I'm kind of torn, to be honest. I like it when teams are brave, and I massively commend Ferrari for going down this route with Bearman because Samarth was explaining earlier why it made sense for him to be the option this weekend, but they didn't need to do that. They could have had it so that when he's in F2, he's focused on F2 and that they have someone else who they trust within their pool of drivers to be around. They could do that without breaking a sweat. But they don't because they back Bearman to be the option on the off chance they need him. So and I think that shows a continuation of a change for Ferrari. Leclerc started it when they picked him in his second year to replace Kimi Räikkönen. But this doesn't happen 10 years ago at Ferrari. They don't have an 18-year-old reserve driver for starters, let alone actually put him in the car.
I put Luca Badoer in. Well, that's more like 15 years ago now. My time certainly flies. It only feels like yesterday. Mark, a question from Juan Jose Aguirre, who says, how did Hamilton manage to keep Piastri at arm's reach on used tyres?
He was quicker at the end of the straight. So we touched on this before. And the McLaren was slow onto the straights and slow at the end of the straight. So Lewis was driving very, very defensively and very well. And it was just those two points on the track that gave him the crucial advantage at the natural overtaking spot. And he just stuck to his task.
Next up, a question for you, Samarth, from Annie Kramer, who says, has had a solid day out in Jeddah with some good teamwork along the way. Are they climbing the ranks or is this a full storm?
That's a tough question. I mean, I'm going to kind of weasel out of this and just say it's neither. In a way, it's not a false storm because Haas are improving and they're learning from the upgrades they brought recently, and the tyre issues they seem to have last year do show signs of kind of diminishing. At the same time, climbing the ranks is a bit strong given the midfield is so tight. It's little things like today where you have Magnussen backing up the pack and creating a train of cars that really help and they can really shape the contest. Scott, what do you think about this?
Well, I was going to just chime in quickly and be a little bit more optimistic with Haas because I think what Haas is doing at the moment is maximising everything that it has at its disposal. Not in every given session. Ed was explaining earlier very well how it botched qualifying on not one but both of its cars, which isn't great. But in terms of the way that they've approached this season, the work that they've done in the off season to get the race one package wherever it could be, understand that package as well as possible in testing, start on the front foot, and then not just do that in Bahrain, but continue that in Saudi. That tactic does not work 100 times out of 100 in the 2023 Haas, but it did today because of the progress that they've made. At the same time as them hitting pretty much their maximum, a couple of other teams are dropping the ball. Sauber is nowhere near where that team should be in terms of its performance. Williams is starting the season on the back foot because it had a horrible winter that made its car late, and there are some things that aren't on the car that should be on the car. Everything's a bit rushed, and so it's just not very refined. That's two teams immediately that are giving Haas an opportunity. Alpine, how many times have we said this already this year? Absolutely nowhere near where a works team should be, not even close to where they were last year. That's the third team that's opened the door. All of a sudden, that's both cars in Q2 for Haas. Every weekend, possibly. And once you're in Q2, you're sniping at points, especially when you've got a car that can actually do a race distance. So I actually think, contrary to their expectation and ours, we'll hold our hands up to this, so we got it wrong. But to be fair, Haas got it wrong as well. They started the season as competitively as they could possibly have hoped, and other teams have dropped the ball. So they have moved up the ranks versus where they were at the end of last season.
I think where you have to be careful that it is treated as a false dawn is that I don't think this casts aside the long-term concerns about that team and the fact it's not being invested in enough, and the fact that over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, huge challenge for 26 as well, that it's going to slide backwards. But it does show that it's an effective racing team that can do a decent job and be competitive in the short term. Also, it doesn't answer the question of can it finally develop a car, because it never has. And this could easily be that repeat false dawn of past years where it scores some points early on and then fades to nothing. Yeah, very much so. A question from Jack Aitken now, who says, the Racing Bulls don't seem to be as fast as many of us thought coming into the season. Where does this team fit into the 2024 pecking order so far, Scott? I actually think it is about where we thought it would be. I think it's a marginal Q2, Q3 car, and it could score points behind, the biggest teams if it hooked everything up. But it just isn't hooking everything up. It's missing opportunities. And I feel like it might end up being a little bit like last year. Ed, how many races last year at the start of the season did Tsunoda end up finishing 11th? It was a bunch of races in a row, wasn't it? Yeah, he was a serial P11 finisher early on. He was the new Esteban Gutierrez, wasn't he? yeah, always thereabouts, but not quite in the points. Yeah, and it feels like that's where it is this year. You mentioned earlier in talking about when Haas sniped and got that solitary point. There are 5 teams that are clearly quicker than everybody else. We had the suspicion that RB was at the back of that group at best. Probably thought they'd be slightly better than the rest of the midfield, which hasn't been the case. But that can come down to just execution and driver performance when it's this tightly matched. So I actually think it's more or less there in the midfield. It's clearly better than a few of the other teams around them. But it's just going to get gazumped by 1 or 2 other teams on any given weekend if it doesn't maximise everything, and that's what could cause it to miss out on points finishes. But I think everything maximised, Tsunoda probably should have been the one that scored that point today. And the final question I'll take from Hamish McDonald. In 2021, there was a lot of discussion after the missile attacks by the Houthis. However, nothing mentioned by F1 this year. Is this still a talking point between the journalists? Were you provided with special travel advice? And in addition, does anyone else have a deja vu moment with appendicitis super sub Ollie Bearman? Well, yeah, obviously Nick de Vries last year when Alex Albon had appendicitis came in. 2022. Time once again making a fool of you, Ed. Oh, yeah, no, absolutely right. Yeah, time's passing far too quickly. Yeah, Monza 22, which of course got De Vries his full-time race seat for last year that turned out not to be as full-time as he hoped. So yeah, similar circumstances. Well, thankfully, Carlos Sainz didn't have any of the complications that Alex Albon did, and Carlos was in the paddock today. He looked like someone who just had an operation, but he was up and about and fully engaged in what was going on in the race, cheering on Ollie Bearman and also Charles Leclerc. But I think Bearman's F1 future will be a longer and brighter one than Nick de Vries is ultimately proved to be. But yeah, on the other point, it is still a talking point. There's no specific reason for it to have flared up. And obviously there's always discussions around Saudi Arabia and sporting events, etc. Snooker was getting the brunt of it this particular week with their new tournament going on. There was no special travel advice. There's general. So I'm obviously coming from the UK. There's a UK Foreign Office instructions and that kind of thing, but nothing in particular. But there are things going on. The Red Sea is quite active. There is plenty going on with the Houthis as well still. So it's still there bubbling on in the background, but it didn't flare up as a big talking point this weekend, thankfully. And I'm sure there will be points in the future where they're talking points again. Well, thanks very much to Scott, Samarth and Mark for your insight, and do head to therace.com, plenty to read there. Mark's race analysis. Scott's been working on all sorts, including his look at the Red Bull situation, and my driver rankings will be there at some point on Sunday. And we, of course, have got now a 2-week gap to the Australian Grand Prix, but we're going to keep podcasting throughout, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.